So political correctness, I think, has gone amok. I know it's no longer considered politically correct to talk about a handicapped or disabled person, but I think it's gone a little bit too far when the local DJ just recently got on the radio and said there's a huge traffic jam over Mission Valley due to a mechanically challenged automobile. Wow. I think that's going a little bit too far. So that is some of what my topic is tonight. I have a person who is soon going to be related to me, and she is named Jessie, and she is dating my daughter Jerry, and they haven't gotten engaged or married, so maybe I shouldn't show them this video. But she is applying to schools and trying to get in. She has a little bit of Asian blood in her, and she came to me recently and said, should I be telling anybody that I'm Asian? And I said, well, it depends on whether you want to be discriminated against or not. And I did some research, and I found out that actually in the Socialist Republic of California, you are less likely to be discriminated against if you are Asian than you are anywhere else in the country. Okay. And that is because of Proposition 209. You see, Proposition 209, which was passed in 1984, states that no one in a California admissions systems can use race as any type of qualification for whether or not you should be admitted to their school. And this has been challenged in court 3 times, and 3 times it has been upheld. And so as a result, you now find there's quite a bit of difference between the percentage of, I did the same thing 3 times.
Jerry knows his stuff.
So there's a huge difference. If you go to the Ivy Leagues, the maximum Asian population in any of the Ivy Leagues is about 15%, and I'm going to go over that in one of the graphs that I've given you. It's an unofficial quota system. If you go here in California, you will find that the Asian percentage in a place like Caltech is 43%, almost 3 times more. And if you compare that to what's going on in the school system locally, for example, at Berkeley or UC San Diego, you'll find the same numbers.
So over 50% at UC.
Yes. So when you have to compete totally on the basis of merit, we're discovering something interesting. We're getting beaten by the Asians, which is good if you're an Asian, like my future daughter-in-law. So let me step back and talk a little bit about what's going on at Harvard. Harvard is being sued right now. They're being sued by a group of Asian people who are upset that there's not as many Chinese and Japanese and Koreans as there should be. Now the percentage of the population of those people in America is about 5%. 5%. But if you look at the percentage of national merit scholars, and people have done this, they've looked through all the national merit scholars because their names are published. And you can say, oh, well, this Lee person looks like it's probably an Asian. And you can look at Goldsmith and say, oh, they're probably Jewish. And if they're not one of those categories, people look through and figure out what other categories they are. So what they're doing is trying to figure out what percentage of the top scholars in the country happen to be Asian, happen to be Jewish, happen to be black, if they can figure that out, and so forth. And then they compare them to the percentage that the place like Harvard might actually promote, because they'd like to brag about their percentages of demographics and exactly how many that they have that are certain categories. And there's a huge difference between the scores on the national merit scholarships, and those are the top 5% of the people who take the PSATs and score in the top 0.5%. And what they have found is that even though the Asians are only 5% in terms of demographics, they end up being 40% of the top performers on these tests. They're 8 times more likely to be study fanatics. And you guys might know from personal experience that that's true. There's not a lot of Asians in this club because they're doing something else as opposed to enjoying themselves with us. So let me go ahead and go over a couple of the reasons why this is bad. One is it's violating Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You see, that was designed to prevent discrimination against blacks. And the whole affirmative action program basically said, we're going to use racist policies to undo the previous racism against blacks. So that was what that goal was about. And that's what's currently supposed to be honored in every single school system's admission policies. But it's currently being violated. And we know that's the case because Harvard has come out, for example, and admitted that only 50% of the people that they admit in each class are based on people who score perfectly on the SATs or have perfect GPAs. Back 30 or 40 years ago, 7 out of 8 people who were perfect were given an admission letter. Now it's down to 50%. So obviously, if they've gone from almost everybody gets in to only 50% get in who are perfect, then half of their class are being admitted on the basis of something other than merit. And Alan Dershowitz, who by no means is a conservative lawyer, most of you who know him to be the exact opposite. And I would say he's now a moderate since he's actually come out and had the chutzpah to defend Donald Trump against the recent violation of attorney-client privilege, and he's the only liberal in the whole country who seems to have any integrity. But this is what he said. There was a lawsuit that was established. It was Bakke versus the UC Regents. And this was a lawsuit that happened 20, 30 years ago. And in it, Bakke had been denied admission to California, even though he had perfect SATs, perfect GPA, perfect extracurriculars. I mean, he was the most qualified candidate ever. But he got denied admission because there was actually quotas on Asian people. And they wouldn't allow more than a certain amount of Asian people in. So he sued, and he won, technically, but it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, for the sake of diversity, we'll allow you to use race as an element, but it shouldn't be the primary one. So that's what's guiding the rest of the country. The rest of the country has not got an official policy of segregation and quotas. They have an unofficial policy. They try not to put it in writing, but they do brag about it later. So Alan Dershowitz came out and said, but put simply, Bakke legitimized an admissions process that is inherently capable of gross abuse and that has in fact been deliberately manipulated for the specific purpose of perpetuating religious and ethnic discrimination in college admissions. So here's a liberal coming out and saying, we're doing the exact opposite, guys, of what we said we were going to do. We don't want to judge people on the basis of race, but that's exactly what's happening everywhere else except in California. That's why this guy has integrity. So one of the reasons that they know that there's problems over at Harvard is Harvard admits and enrolls essentially the same percentage of African Americans, Hispanics, whites, and Asians every single year, even those percentages of the population have been dramatically changing. All right, so let's go to some of the facts that I handed out in that outline. I was going to put this up on the wall, but I figured that I didn't know what type of audio-visual equipment would be available for me today, so I ended up just taking a handout and putting it together. So if you look at the first page of this handout, you're going to see something that's rather troubling, depending on which statistic category you're in. We'll just take for as example this very first graph. This is a period of time from 1970, gosh, my eyesight's horrible, up to about today. This section is the white section of who does well on the US Math Olympiad teams. The orange section is the Asian section. And the blue section, unfortunately, is the Jewish section, the whites who happen to be Jewish. And if you look at all of these graphs, you'll see a very troubling trend. The Jews used to do extremely well. They used to be, well, I'll give you an example. Last week I talked about how they're 25% of all of those who get Nobel Prizes. So over time, even though they're only 2% of the population, they were 12.5 times more likely to win a Nobel Peace Prize in humanities or science than the average white person. That number has been falling. they are still 3 times more likely, but they're no longer 12 times more likely. And in the meantime, the Asians have become 8 times more likely to win those prizes than their 5% of the population. They're winning 40%, 40% of all of the prizes. Whether it's Math Olympics, whether it's College Putnam Math winners, US Physics, Science Olympiads, they're doing great. So they should be at 40% of the college population if it weren't for affirmative action. And they are here in California, where we outlawed affirmative action. You have to ask yourself, if the most progressive, liberal, socialistic state in the whole country has gotten rid of affirmative action, why can't the rest of the country? Okay, so if you go to this next graph, you will see that there are a number of schools, Caltech, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, Columbia, Cornell, Dartmouth. Every single one of these lines, with the exception of Caltech, has a certain percentage of Asian enrollment that started off within a band of about 7% to 15%, and now is all congregated over the last 21 years to basically 15%. It's almost like a bunch of monopolists or oligarchs got together and decided, we're all going to establish this as our price level. 15% is what we think we should allow them to have. And yet, what would they get in a place like Caltech if they had to compete on the basis of merit only? They'd be at 40%. Pretty scary stuff. That's why there's a lawsuit. So, then let's go to the third page. Now, on the third page, I talked about Title VI, and I mentioned that earlier. When our taxes are being used to promote racism, which is what affirmative action is, that's supposed to be illegal. Now, Bakke, the Supreme Court came and said, well, you're not really supposed to, but we'll let you have a little bit of discretion. But that little bit of discretion has been blown into a huge abuse. And that's why this lawsuit has been put in place. On this handout, it also talks about Proposition 209, which actually is just a restatement of Title VI. It was inspired by Title VI. It's what Title VI was meant to be. It's what our whole country could have been if we didn't have that Bakke lawsuit. Now, the Jews back in 1920, and I use the word and the example of Jews because it's used by the people who study this, because people used to discriminate against them. And back in 1920, they discriminated against them a lot. So one of these graphs shows that all the WASPs that used to be at Harvard admissions program back in 1920 had the number of Jews were rising, and then it fell dramatically. Why is that? Because they were being sued at that time for discriminating against Jews. So they had to increase the number of Jews in order to avoid losing the lawsuit. And as soon as the lawsuit got dismissed, what do you think they did? They went back to discriminating against the Jews. Wrong. Bad. Now, the second graph is what they're currently doing to Asians. And you'll see that what's happening to the Asians is very, very similar to what they used to do to the Jews. They have these people on the admissions committee, and they've decided that they only want a certain percentage of the Asians, that it will affect their diversity to let them take over the campus, even if they're more qualified to do so. And there's currently, or there was a lawsuit similar to the one that's currently in effect today. And as soon as that lawsuit got dismissed, what happened to the percentage of the Asians? It fell, just like what they did when they abused their position and discriminated and were anti-Semitic. Same thing's happening, guys. That's why history should be taught in our schools. History like this. Is this anything you guys would ever have heard about if it wasn't me going out and spending my free time bringing this to your attention to excite you? You would miss out on all of this excitement. I can tell right now. You're all going to be high-fiving nagging me later for bringing this to your attention.
You just described it about the answer.
Okay, so now, let's go to the next page. The last page here shows over time how these different places like Harvard, and I use Harvard because it's the most egregious abuser right now, but also because I graduated from there. I mean, what the heck, I might as well just admit it. And it's not just discrimination against races. I mean, I saw recently on the Red Book, the Red Book is where everybody who doesn't belong to Facebook tells everyone what they've been doing for the last 5 years and talks about how wonderful they are and lies sometimes, but not other times. Well, 84% of them were all bragging about how they voted for Obama. And I said, I knew it! I knew I was surrounded by liberal Democrats at that school. I've joked for years that I got into Harvard under their affirmative action program for conservatives. Because I was one of very few who was there. Obviously, if they cared about diversity, which they all like to brag about, they'd have diversity of opinion. Because diversity of opinion is where you actually get good ideas that fight in the public marketplace to see which one is better than the other. It's why we have Democrats and Republicans fighting all the time. It's why Machiavelli talked about the reason Rome was great is because the nobles and the plebes were always fighting against each other, and eventually they came to a solution that displeased both of them equally. And as a result, they had a better country for it. How likely is that to happen when 84 to 90% all believe in the cookie cutter political correctness that has been established as the prevailing theme of your campus? You're not going to have any discussions, you're going to have bullying. Aren't they against bullying too? Right now the people who are being bullied the most are the Christians and the whites who don't get, or misrepresented on campus, the Asians who don't even get a slot, and all of the conservatives and Catholics and Republicans who are treated like lepers. You have to come to a club like this to be able to speak out. And even then, I don't know what's going to happen to my car on the way out tonight.
Hey, Jim's car was okay after last week. You're fine.
So this last page summarizes everything that I was saying. And you can ask yourself, well, why do the Asians have an advantage in producing 8 times as many highly qualified people who should be given the slots in these universities? Well, they have a work ethic. If you go to a place like Japan or you go to China, you will find out that the most important thing is to study, and that you humiliate your entire family if you don't get an A or a B plus on the next test. And in fact, they have well, I wouldn't say capital punishment, but corporal punishment for those who don't perform. They also have the highest suicide rates of anywhere in the industrialized world. I mean, there is a negative component to that. But that type of pressure, which is similar to what the Tiger Mom talked about. Do you guys remember reading about the Tiger Mom and the Harvard graduate who took her 2 children, and even when they were on vacation, they spent 3 hours practicing the piano and the violin? They would actually go to the hotel. I read the book. I was so excited I just couldn't put it down. And they went to the hotel and said, you have a spare piano here. We have someone who's 12 years old who will play that piano better than any professional that you have ever hired. And they would say, oh no, that couldn't possibly happen. I said, oh, give her a chance. Listen to her 1 minute, and then let her play for the next 3 hours. And that's what they did. They let her play for 1 minute, and all of a sudden they'd have a huge crowd gather around looking at this prodigy, this 12-year-old who did nothing but play the piano and study her entire life. She had no childhood. I mean, she probably was emotionally retarded. But when it came to social, I mean, when it came to intelligence and being able to meet all these qualifications and qualify for these great scholarships, she was top-notch, 100%. So, I mean, I'm not saying that that's the way all of us should go. There's advantages and disadvantages, but that type of work ethic is why they perform better. And it's something that we can learn from them if we care about getting our kids out of the house and making a life for themselves someday. So what is the point of this? Why bring this up? How does this affect you? It affects you if you have children who you want to get into college and you want them to be treated fairly. Right now you have them apply to California, which is more meritocratic than anywhere else in the country, including my alma mater. But second, we can learn from the advantages that these other people have and the work ethics that they have and state, if we want our children to succeed, Bruce, pay attention. Now, if we want our children to succeed,
Really?
yes,
Make this about me, okay?
He's trying to make it better.
then
And he's not even Asian.
we have to
Really?
encourage these people
Caucasian.
to follow in the footsteps of those who have shown us how to succeed. Fellow Toastmasters.
Oh.